Hi, we move into 1 Samuel 18 with a radical change of subject and a topic that has been incredibly controversial, especially over the last half century or so, as scholars try to engage these ancient texts from the questions and perspectives of our modern and postmodern reality. Namely, in this question, the relationship between David and Jonathan, and what kind of a relationship is it? And I want to say right at the beginning, I'm not going to be able to answer that question. I honestly don't think anybody can answer that question with a specific yes or no answer. For example, were David and Jonathan gay? Is this a homosexual relationship, etc.? Because there's just simply not enough data from the text to answer it. So if you're hoping for a definitive answer, you're going to be disappointed here, and I think that's just simply the honest evaluation of the text. But that doesn't mean that scholars haven't engaged it and grappled with it and tried to make a claim one way or another, and many scholars do make that strong claim. But the fact that scholars are fairly equally divided among three different positions, as we'll see, highlights the fact that there's certainly no consensus among them, and the text probably will never allow there to be such a consensus. But it is also important that we look at it in detail and understand the role that Jonathan plays as the son of Saul, and obviously as the friend and partner in whatever level we want to analyze and label that with David, as the monarchy begins to shift from the hands of Saul to the hands of David. So we're going to look at a number of tools to help us do that. And today we're just going to look at the first 4 verses, but we will be continuing with the story of Jonathan and David as we continue through these chapters, as you can see on the right side of the screen. So let's turn there right now. You can see the blue sections are the ones about Jonathan from before or apart from David, and the purple ones are in relation to David. So we've already seen Jonathan in chapter 13 and 14, where he led 1,000 men successfully against the Philistines, and then had that miraculous battle with just him and his one young man against the Philistines at Michmash Pass. Then we saw the ominous incident where Saul almost had Jonathan killed because he'd vowed that anyone who dared to eat and broke the vow of eating would be killed, and it turned out to be Jonathan, whose eyes brightened when he ate some of the honey, and yet Saul was ready to kill him if Jonathan hadn't been protected by his fellow soldiers. So we already know that there's some tension between Saul and Jonathan, but so far Jonathan has not met David until the scene we get here. And not to have a spoiler alert, but we're going to see right away that Jonathan is immediately tightly connected with David. And so that's what we see here in 18:1-4. Then in the next chapter, we'll see that Jonathan sides with David against his father Saul, and he does that again in chapter 20, and then finally in chapter 23, Jonathan tells David not to fear Saul, and they make 3 covenants throughout this. Notice that these are separated by a number of other incidents, as we'll see. So chapter 18 is long, and this is just the first 4 verses, and chapter 19 is long as well. Chapter 20 is mostly Jonathan and David, and here this is only 3 verses. So the Jonathan-David things are going to be interspersed, and curiously, they're going to be alternated between David and Michal, or Michal, depending on how you want to pronounce that, one of the daughters of Saul that he offers to David as a wife. And so we can see here a little 5-part chiasm of the alternating Jonathan and Michal scenes as we go. And a number of other things that we need to pay attention to just broadly as we begin to look at the language. One of the questions is as sons. So we saw last video, and I left up the last verse of it. I talked for a while at the end of this key question and David's key answer. Saul saying to David, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." And without trying to repeat what I did in the last video, we know that this is not "I was," but a present statement. That's his identity. And yet in 2 verses, Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. So there's going to be this battle over who is David's father, and which is to say, who is Saul's son, which is to say, who is to inherit the monarchy. But even as I frame it that way, we should note that the question of the monarchy back in 1 Samuel 8 was not a matter of dynasty. It was a matter of Yahweh picking somebody and then the people affirming it. So we know that Yahweh has picked David in place of Saul. We've not heard anything about Yahweh picking Jonathan. But Saul understands just by instinct, apparently, that his son would be the successor. And of course, that's the way patriarchal monarchy almost always works. But not always. Certainly in the Roman Empire later, there were sometimes that worked and sometimes there were usurpers and others. So depending upon the particular empire or monarchy kingdom, it can be different. But Saul's certainly assuming explaining that here. And we'll see that in the tension that we see here throughout the rest of this book until Jonathan and Saul are both killed. So the red parts are the things that refer to son of Saul, and the purple other fathers or mothers. And I won't go over this in detail, but we can right now. But we can see right in our initial chapter where we just saw this, the question is going to be David as son-in-law to the king. Notice not as son directly, but as son-in-law. Later, Saul will refer to David directly as son here, my son David, a number of times. And so we'll see that go that way. But in the end, we'll see Saul and his 3 sons all died in the same day. And David is obviously not listed as one of those. Another aspect of what we need to be looking at throughout this section is the role of a couple of key words, and these are 2 of several that we'll see. The verb ahav and the noun form ahaba, meaning love. And one of the difficulties is in English, we know there's almost no verb that has more semantic range than the verb love. I've often done to students to indicate just how important it is for translation and reading to complete the simple 3-word sentence, I love blank, and note how many different categories of things you can fill in there. I'd invite you to do a similar thing. Maybe just hit pause here or stop for a moment and just make a list of all the things that you can fill out with the sentence, I love. And then ask, is the verb love saying the same thing about your relationship with all those things? Just for instance, pizza, your favorite sports team, God, your parents, the place you live, other things you like to do, reading Bible stories. So it can be objects or relationships or abstractions. I love America, or I love my job, or so many different things. And that one verb is not self-defining across all those relationships. The verb ahev is not quite as flexible as the English word love, but not surprisingly, it has a range of meanings. And scholars have generally decided, especially in work in the last half century or so, between 2 meanings, the relational meaning, the erotic and sexual meaning, and the political meaning. But I'd like to suggest that the dichotomy between those is overstated and perhaps false altogether. The personal is the political, as feminists began to say way back in the 60s and especially in the 70s, highlighting the fact that women's issues at the time were often domestic internal issues about parenting or sexuality and contraception and abortion, as well as childcare, and those are, quote, personal issues. They're obviously also political, as they are today. There's no more issue more political than abortion, which is also a obviously very personal issue. And certainly in the Bible as well, we saw in the book of Genesis, Abraham's penis is a political tool because out of Abraham's penis will come the seed that will produce nations. And the question of whether those nations are us or them is obviously a political question. And so whether it's a literal fact of procreation or the political issues around sexuality and gender, the personal is political all the way through. But even at another level, we know that there could be what we might call nepotism, which is favoring the people one's related to or the people one loved for political positions. Did John Kennedy make his brother Robert Attorney General because he'd done a survey and he thought that Robert Kennedy was the best qualified person to be Attorney General, or because he was his beloved brother and he knew him well? And so one of the aspects of the personal being political is politics works well when people know each other and they can trust each other. And the personal is the context in which people do that. Certainly the political is often the place where people cover over aspects of trust with obfuscation and formality. My friend, the dear senator from so-and-so, which may be somebody you totally hate, but that's what you say because that's the protocol. So we're going to have to look more closely at this without having to achieve, as many scholars feel the need to do, an either or in whether love in these stories is erotic or political. And ultimately, there's no sexuality described at all between Jonathan and David, so we can't conclude there's any sexual relationship, but we can certainly say there's an attraction and describe it as the text describes it. So one more element of that before we begin to look at our story. As a number of scholars have noted, Susan Ackerman, especially recently in her book Heroes as Lovers, has noted that the meeting between Michal and David is very similar to between Jonathan and David, which is to say the relationship between Jonathan and David is portrayed much like a marriage relationship. Of course, they're not actually married. That is impossible, and the text would never be so scandalous to say so. But as you can see from this chart, in the magenta parts here, we see the life of Jonathan bound to the life of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own life. And we see Saul's daughter Michal loved David, as well as the king's servants loved David. And then we see here Saul's son Jonathan took great delight in David, and as the king takes delight with David. And we'll look at the word for delight when we get to these passages later. So there are a number of elements of whether it's Saul who has the same kind of delight that Jonathan has. Is it that Saul is erotically jealous of Jonathan's relationship with David? Most scholars would doubt that, but we can't exclude it altogether. And as we'll see, there are a number of obvious phallic symbols, most obviously Saul throwing his spear at David, and the question of that back and forth that makes certainly some kind of homoerotic theme there, if not explicit. So those are a number of issues, and as we look at the whole chapter, there are some key issues as we've seen here. And I've modified the NORSV to highlight some of the literal elements of that because they're hidden from the Hebrew in the translation. Most specifically, the role of eyes and of hands and of face. So notice all the body parts. The Hebrew, more often than English, describes emotions and relations with physical body parts. And so I've left those here so we can see the face-to-face elements and what people see in their eyes. So things are good in their eyes or evil in their eyes, or they're afraid. He's afraid of David's face, or he's removed him from his face. So a number of those elements, but also obviously the role of love and the repeated emphasis on David's success, as we see here, and two daughters. Merab is a daughter and Michal is a daughter. So in addition to sons, there are daughters here. So we're going to look at those key words as we explore what is the explosive beginning of this chapter. So let's jump right over to our text. Notice the narrator introduces verse 1 of chapter 18 is explicitly continuous with what we saw before, when David had finished speaking to Saul. So not later or the next day or whatever. So they've had this conversation. This appears to be right after the death of Goliath. And as we looked at before, in this version of Saul and David meeting, it seemed to suggest that Saul doesn't know David, but that's only one way to interpret it. It could be, as I started to suggest at the beginning, the question of, are you Jesse's son or are you my son? Or will you become my son? But certainly at the surface level, it appears that this is Saul not knowing who David is, even though he's met him a couple other times. If you're confused about that, I encourage you to go back and watch the videos on chapter 17. But as we get to chapter 18, notice how suddenly it shifts. When David had finished speaking to Saul, the soul, we'll look at that in a minute, of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Based on what? And some scholars, seeing this as an erotic love relationship, describe it as love at first sight, but there are a number of questions that challenge that. First of all, we have to deal with soul. There is no word for soul in the Hebrew Bible, period. This is just simply a wrong translation at every possible level. It's nephesh. And nephesh is a word that applies to every living being. We see Genesis 1. All the animals are nephesh, which is to say anything that is breathing and living. And as a substantive noun here, as a part of somebody, it simply means their life, their essence. Soul is a Greek concept, and this text is very far from a Greek world, both in terms of language, but also in terms of the historical relationship. Whenever this text was written, and the various arguments we've seen, only the most radical reinterpreters would suggest the story is written in Hellenistic times. So no soul. The life of Jonathan was bound to the life of soul or life. Clearly, Jonathan is tightly connected with David for no apparent reason. As we've seen, they've not met before, and David is still just speaking to his father, and we didn't even know that Jonathan was on the scene. But suddenly, out of nowhere, he is completely attached. And this is where some scholars suggest that this is love at first sight. Others disagree, and as we're not going to try to resolve that, maybe we can see a both and. There's something about David that attracts people to him, and Jonathan is one of those people. As we saw in our key words on the right side of the screen, we're going to see that Michal loves David, and the Israelites love David, and the Judahites love David, and the servants of Saul love David. Maybe there was something about him besides his military prowess that was attractive, not just to women, but obviously to men and to people in general. And the text can't exactly convey that, but we know he was handsome, but it has to be something more, the kind of thing that leads politicians or others to have that something that makes people love them and be drawn to them. But the text can only do what it can do to convey that. But whatever it is, Jonathan's infected by it, and he's immediately on David's side. We don't know from verse 1 what the commitment is, but before our little scene here in verse 4 is over, we'll see exactly what Jonathan's intention is. So the relationship with Jonathan and David is interrupted immediately by Saul. Saul doing what kings do. He took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house, which recalls 8:11, the original concern that Yahweh reported to Samuel to report to the people what kings do. And let's look back at that for one moment here. He said, "These will be the ways of your king who will reign over you. He will take your sons." And then in the next verse, he will appoint for himself commanders of thousands, commanders of 50. And that's exactly what Saul will do with David, make him a commander of thousands. So he's taking the son of Jesse here and not letting him return. Notice that we don't know what David's response to any of this is. Is this really coercive? Does David want to go back to his father's house? He is there with Saul, and he's obviously already killed Goliath, and he's been playing music for Saul. So we have no reason to think that he doesn't want to stay there, but certainly the king is exerting coercion here, would not let him return. The word for return is one we'll see a number of times here, this issue of going back and forth. And here it's highlighting on not mentioning Jesse, but the father's house, the Bayit Ab, which is the basic unit of society in the Israelite world. The next up is the Mishpacha, or the extended clan. Father's house is not simply the building that the father lives in, but as house is the central metaphor of the entire monarchy story, as Polzin pointed out in the 80s. We can see this as personal and political just as well. In other words, the house of David that will arise is not just the physical house of cedar that he builds and then wonders where the house for Yahweh should be, but the monarchy, the dynasty. The house of David is the succession of people that come from David that will become kings. And so in that sense, father's house is not just Jesse and the building, but the entire lineage. And the question will be, will David become part of the lineage of Saul? And we see the first round of that will be the question of son-in-law, but as we saw in our chart here, eventually Saul will just address David directly as son. So he won't let him return to his father's house, and then it returns back to Jonathan after this first interruption of Saul's perspective. We don't know whether Jonathan knows about what his father's doing here. They're portrayed separately, not together. So Jonathan made the first of 3 covenants here with David. We see this one in chapter 18. We'll see the second one 2 chapters later in chapter 20, and a third one in chapter 23. But this one perhaps is one way. We don't really know if it's together. It says Jonathan made the covenant. It doesn't say Jonathan and David made a covenant together, sort of like Jacob and Laban after Jacob begins to leave with his wives, who are, of course, Laban's daughters, Rachel and Leah, back in Genesis. But here, it could perhaps just be from Jonathan's perspective, that he is vowing himself to be bound to David, and the covenant in his own mind is the way he's doing that. Whether it's formal or not, we won't know until chapter 20. And it's repeated here, and the reason is he loved him. So again, we don't know if this is meant to be erotic and personal or political, and we don't have to decide because it's certainly both. And then we get to the key verse 4, where we certainly see what Jonathan's intention is. So having loved him as his own life and having made a covenant, now he takes away everything that shows that he's entitled to be the successor to his father. And as Brueggemann notes here, it's a dramatic act that seems to transfer to David Jonathan's right to claim the throne. And Jobling adds, the kingship has in effect already passed from Saul to David by the mediation of Jonathan. But of course, only from Jonathan's perspective. We don't know what Saul's perspective is on this yet, and as we'll see, Saul is not going to give up easily, and he's going to make many attempts on David's life, and it's going to be quite a battle all the way through the end of the book when Saul and Jonathan are killed together. So Jonathan stripped himself. The verb shit here parallel to David taking off Saul's armor. So in the same way that David couldn't wear the royal outfit of Saul, Jonathan cannot wear the princely outfit that he's entitled to. Namely his robe here, which is connected with Samuel's robe back in chapter 2, Saul's robe in chapter 15, and it'll also be connected with Saul's robe when David threatens to cut the hem off it, an obvious phallic imagery of a knife against Saul's robe. So we'll see the role of royal robes, again, political and personal together there. So he strips himself of the robe that he was wearing and gave it to David. Again, we don't see David's response. Sumira notes there, Jonathan gave while Saul took. And then these other elements, which it's not saying he's wearing at the time, but plainly his warrior elements, not just the royal element of the robe, but his armor, not Saul, his father's armor, but his own armor, and his sword, two phallic symbols, the sword and the bow. The sword we've only seen so far, Goliath's sword, which we'll see again, and his bow and his belt. And we'll see him using the bow. It'll be symbolic later when he shoots some arrows to make a signal about whether Saul is there or not. But as many scholars have noted, being an archer was a powerful expression of masculinity for an Israelite at the time, to be a good archer. It's not just that it's a phallic symbol, which it obviously is, but it's a military weapon. David is not an archer as far as we know. He's a slinger. He killed Goliath with his powerful sling, which certainly could be shot at least as far, if not farther, than an arrow. But by Jonathan giving up his armor and his sword and his arrows and his belt, he's showing he will not be a warrior, and he's passing that on to David. So before we go, let's look at how a few artists have portrayed this connection here between David and Jonathan. And these are from centuries ago, so none of them will be addressing the question of, is this a homosexual or a gay relationship? That question simply wasn't in their mind. But the fact that it wasn't in their mind, I think, makes it even more interesting of how they portray this from their cultural context. So the first one we see is from Cima de Conegliano from 1507. I think this one is a little bit unintentionally humorous, with Goliath's head there, right there in David's hand, painted in sort of a flat way. He doesn't look like a dead head. The color looks certainly like there's life in it, but it's also not particularly large. So there they are, just walking together like friends. Then we see the Rembrandt version from a century later, where David and Jonathan are together, and there's a hug taking place. And this is interesting to me because it's very similar to Rembrandt's Prodigal Son painting, as you can see here from Luke 15. In the Prodigal Son, of course, it's a father welcoming a son who's been lost, welcoming him back, and that's not the relationship between David and Jonathan. But maybe if you're an art historian, you can put a comment there about what is going on. Maybe Rembrandt just liked hugs. I'm sure it's something more than that. And then finally, this one from 2 centuries later, from 1882, from a stained glass window detail in St. Mark's Portobello in Glasgow, Scotland, the soul of Jonathan knit with the soul of David. And I looked as far as I could find for a full image of this window and couldn't find it, only this detail. But certainly this is suggesting some kind of loving relationship. Do you see it as erotic? Erotic is certainly in the eye of the beholder, and it's often in the eye, isn't it, that we see that the eye is the window to the soul or to the life or the inner being, is what people can look at. And so as artists paint the eyes, viewers with their own eyes can see whether the eyes suggest something more than brotherly or friendly love. So with that in mind, we'll see that our next scene will turn to David's success, and the more David is successful, the more Saul's paranoia will grow, and the battle between the house of David and the house of Saul will continue. See you there for that next time. Bye-bye.